Hi, friend. I'm Sarita, and this is Missionary Life. I'm here to help you live your dream life on and off the mission field. I'm an author, life coach, former missionary, compassion fatigue and grief expert, and working mom. I want to encourage you to design a life of purpose, authenticity, ease, and meaning where you're no longer surviving but thriving. I'm here to help you, the helpers, become emotionally, spiritually, and physically healthy. I'll interview experts in mental health and missionaries to offer you practical tools to help you heal from trauma, burnout, grief, and PTSD. I know that life often doesn't work out the way we long for. I'm here to create a safe space to navigate those disappointments and transitions with abundance, so you can live your mission. My new book, Healing Her, a memoir, will be released in June 2024, and I can't wait for you to get it into your hands. Thank you for being here. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Missionary Life. Hi, Marilyn.
Hey, so good to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. So, today I have Marilyn Gardner with me, and her beautiful writing has been a solace to me and many other third culture kids. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of third culture kids between worlds. And so, the reason this is so important is there's so many kids growing up overseas, and they experience a lot of traumas on the field and griefs, and they have a very unique experience. And so, we just want to give voice to that experience. And so, Marilyn, could you introduce yourself for us?
For sure. So, as Rita said, my name is Marilyn Gardner, and I am what is now termed an adult third culture kid. I used to call myself a third culture kid, and someone looked at me and said, "How old are you?" So,
You're like, I'm a kid at heart, okay?
exactly. Thank you. Thank you. So I grew up in the country of Pakistan. My parents had an established home there, and I went there when I was 3 months old.
Wow.
I grew up in Pakistan, then returned to the United States to become a nurse. I knew I wanted to become a nurse because I knew I would never live in America, ever, ever, ever. So I ended up raising my own family and raising my own third culture kids, first in the country of Pakistan, where I grew up, then in the country of Egypt, and then the United States.
Wow.
I'm a public health nurse and I'm a writer, and it's taken me a long time to call myself a writer, but I love writing. My
Mm.
public health nurse job I love, and it puts food on the table, and my writing feeds my soul.
That's awesome. Yeah, me as well. So we're just going to get started here, and you have a beautiful book called Between Worlds, and you have this quote in there that I just adored. You said, "Our homes are not defined by geography or one particular location, but by memories, events, people, and places that span the globe. The losses felt by those of us raised in a country that was different from us can be heavy. To be sure, the gains are also real. The way we look at the world, the wonder of travel, our love of passports and places, and our wish to defend parts of the world that we feel are misunderstood. But along with these come profound losses of people and place. For many of us, the only thing we feel we have left are our memories. We cannot go back to the place that was home. Either it does not exist, or it will not let us in, or danger and cost prohibit a casual trip to indulge the times of homesickness. In its
Mhm.
place is memory." It's so beautiful, Marilyn.
Thank you.
So you have quite a story growing up in Pakistan. And, before we jump into your story, I want to kind of clarify, what does a TCK mean? Because I'm sure a lot of people know, but can you tell me, what does this term mean to you, and what do you feel makes up a TCK identity?
Right. So, thank you for asking that first. Actually, the term, interestingly, is up for some discussion recently, but
Okay.
the term was first developed in the 1960s, and it was developed by a Dr. Ruth Yusin. And Dr. Ruth Yusin was an anthropologist. She went to the country of India with her husband, and as she was working with these expatriates there, she began being fascinated by their children because
Mm,
she realized their children were really different than they were. Their
yeah.
children were operating just outside of the same culture, outside of the same realm. And she noticed that they were neither Indian, but nor
Mm,
were they American. In this case, I
mm,
believe it was primarily Americans that she was working with or
Yeah.
interacting with. So that's who first developed the term. And the
Mm,
common characteristic is spending a significant amount of your developmental years outside of the ancestral culture or the culture
mm-hmm.
of your parents, your legal culture. So it's not like, okay, there's this culture and then there's that culture, and so
Right.
there's this other culture that it's a blend of the two. It's something more nebulous, which I think makes it a little tougher to define. I love Tanya Crossman, who has written this beautiful book
Mm,
called Misunderstood. So
yes.
she writes that there are these three cultures. There's the legal culture, so the culture
Mm,
of the parents. There's the geographic culture,
mm-hmm.
and then there is what I like to call the heart culture. I
Mm-hmm.
forget exactly what she calls it. Oh, she calls it the relational culture.
Mm,
So that makes a lot of sense to me. But the primary characteristics, no matter what definition you use, it's high mobility. It's
mm,
being raised in a place that is different than your parents. And it's this sense of belonging everywhere, but not really belonging anywhere.
yeah.
So struggling with that sense of place and that sense of belonging.
Sure.
For instance, when I found this term, I was in my like late 30s,
Mm-hmm.
and I had just returned from Egypt. I was raising five third culture kids,
Wow.
and it had never been important to me before to figure it out because I'd been living overseas. And so, as long as I was overseas, there
Mm,
was that sense of connection and belonging with others who were also overseas or with other third culture kids. So, when I found it, it was a tremendous healing for me. And my
yes.
concern about the broadening is that it has helped myself and so many kids and now adults
Yeah.
find a place.
Yeah, it makes sense of their experience. That makes a lot of
Right,
sense.
exactly.
Yeah, and I know for the TCKs and MKs in my life, which I have quite a few, it just seems like they have a certain hardiness, like a resiliency in them.
Mhm.
You know, some of the things I notice in them are just the ability to jump into hard situations and
Yeah,
the ability to fight past painful circumstances. And there's just a lot of things I think that living cross culturally gives you as a gift. You know, of course, I know there are
right.
losses, but can you talk a little bit about, growing up in Pakistan? What was it like for you personally to grow up there? What were the joys and what were some of the losses that shaped you?
Great question. So Pakistan was home, right?
Mm,
When you're born into a place, you don't recognize all the things around you. Uh, I remember color and life. I remember beauty,
mm,
and I remember feeling very safe.
yeah.
Pakistan was home. Anything else was other, but
Mm,
Pakistan was home. My family was usually one of the only foreigners wherever we lived. So,
mm,
whereas there were other friends of mine who lived in places where there were several different families and more of a community, more of an expatriate community, I never had that.
mm.
Uh, and then at 6 years old, I went to boarding school.
Oh, wow.
So I've got both the experience of Pakistan and Pakistan as known on the world stage more recently is not a place of beauty. It's not a place of color. It's not a place of
Mm,
life. And yet I was born into this place of color and beauty and life.
mm,
So there's that tension that I
mm-hmm.
feel in this division between the my legal culture, if you will, and the
Right.
place where I'm living now and the place that raised me and that
Yes.
raised me on amazing food and hospitality and friendship. But I was also shaped by going to boarding school so early
Right.
because when you leave home so early, there is a separation. I That was my life, right? So as a
Mm,
kid, you don't realize it. It was later on that I really realized this attachment, what you don't have when you go to boarding school so early. My parents were pretty amazing in terms of the way they handled it. I never felt like I had been shipped off anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There was somehow they instilled in us, and I say this because other children didn't necessarily have this. Some did,
Yeah.
but others didn't. But they instilled in us this sense that if we needed them, they would be there. But it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just a sense, it was a reality. So, for instance, I remember I was 7, my brother had broken his leg. It was November, and where the boarding school was would get very cold. It was in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains.
Mm.
Where my parents lived was very warm, but around November it would get so cold. And I just remember this sense of the deepest homesickness,
Mm.
thinking, my brother's broken his leg. What's going to happen to him? I don't know what to do, and yet not being able to verbalize this. And out of the blue, my mom arrived. She had gotten word of this, and she arrived on this cold November evening, and it was incredible. It was just this, she was warmth and light and love. The way I describe it in my book, Worlds Apart, is she was Psalm 23.
Yeah.
She was my shepherd. She would walk with me through this valley,
Mm-hmm.
which I think about that, and I don't think that's heresy at all, right? When you're a little kid,
Right.
who is going to reflect God to you? It's
Yes.
those people closest, for good or for ill.
Yeah. So some of the joys, it sounds like, were some of the cultural elements you got to experience, and
Right.
sounds like some of the griefs were, being separated from your parents and being a little bit displaced at times.
The loss of displacement, the loss of parents, uh, the we would go back to the U.S. every 4 years for a year,
Right.
and that year was always very tumultuous in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I look at my life, those years are black and white. The
Right.
other years are in color.
Mm. Did other children treat you differently? Did you feel different? And did you notice that difference? And did other kids treat you differently?
In the United States,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, right, right. And New England, where I now live, I live in right in Boston. But I had this, it wasn't a love hate relationship, it was a hate relationship
Mm.
with Massachusetts in particular. And it was because uh, my brothers and I would enter into this world that was so different. And
Mm-hmm.
we were so different. And the most painful of all were the churches. And
Right.
and uh, New England churches have these, at the time, and I think it's probably even more so now, had these tiny youth groups, and we
Mm.
stood out. We were other.
Yeah.
We and if we didn't feel other, we were othered. Even
Mm.
if we
Right.
didn't feel it. And it's kind of funny. My favorite time at a church was, we arrived at this small church, and this young woman my age, I was around 15, she walked up to me and she looked at me and she said, "You're Marilyn, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." I was so
How
used to
did you
just
know?
hating. Yeah, exactly. And she said, "You're coming to my house this afternoon and I'm going to teach you how to shoplift." And I was
Whoa.
over the moon. I thought, yes.
You're like, finally, I have a friend. I don't care if she's a mean girl.
I don't care. I'll shoplift with her. I mean, isn't that sad, right?
That is sad.
But I think back to her, and I think we took Tic Tacs or something. I'm not sure I've confessed that to my priest. I'll have to do that at some point. But
Not sure TikTok was invented yet, but
it was
oh,
just a gift to be
yeah,
seen
yes.
as someone who was the same.
I can imagine. Yeah, I grew up homeschooled actually. So the
Okay.
majority of my early years, I was at home with my mom and my sisters in this little nucleus, little love bubble. And then going into, it was actually a private Christian school, but we faced a lot of bullying and it was really
Mhm.
challenging. And it's not quite the same, but I remember that feeling of standing out and feeling different, and like we didn't get some of the same coarse jokes the kids were telling, and we
Right.
didn't dress the same or talk the same, and it was a stark contrast, and it really does mark you. It does mark you in some way to feel a
Mhm.
little bit like, well, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I different? And so I think that is part of the grief and some of the trauma that TCKs endure.
I think you're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right. You put it back onto yourself. It's why am I this way?
Yeah.
Why am I that way? I remember this significant point in the last few years when I began to write. And I was writing about rearranging the furniture, about how my restlessness, my chronic restlessness. And I was talking to my mom later on. This was about 10, maybe 8 to 10 years ago. And she said, do you know that between the ages of 6 and 18, you never slept in the same bed more than 3 months at a time?
Wow.
And
You're like, no wonder I
suddenly,
feel restless.
right, suddenly my why am I this way turned
Yeah.
into no wonder. And it made so much difference to realize, okay, these things shaped me. This
Mm-hmm.
is not a character flaw. This is a
Mm,
um, natural happening given what I
yeah.
faced or what my life was like when I was little. It was so so helpful.
Yeah, I have a kind of running joke with some of my missionary kid friends because we'll move into a house, and it'll be like a year and a half will pass, and there's no photos hung up on the wall because there's always this sense that I'm going to move again. Like I'm
Yes.
definitely going to move again, so why waste the time to put pictures on the wall? So I'd always go and they'd be like leaning against the wall as if they're going to be put up, but just not put up yet. So it's definitely a quirky little thing that missionary kids and TCKs have.
Yeah, I
Um,
get that. Leaning against the wall like an art gallery.
yes. So you quoted a Syrian painter who said that we all have a map in our bodies composed of the places we have lived, that we are constantly in process of redrawing. That's such a gorgeous sentiment. How do you feel this relates to TCKs?
I felt when I saw that quote, it was such a sort of life quote, and you get these quotes, and they it feels like yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. I feel like these maps in our bodies and the whole redrawing of them happens throughout our life, and I feel like part of the redrawing includes, for many of us, connecting with our passport countries,
Yeah.
connecting with that country that we have this legal document that says you're
Yes.
from there. So that becomes part of the redrawing. And as other places come, that has to be incorporated into it as well.
Mm,
And I think that idea of it being constantly redrawn felt really resonated as well. That this is not a stagnant thing. This is something that throughout our lives, depending on where we live, and it's even a sort of metaphor for the stages of our lives, right? That there's a certain
yes.
map of what goes on in those early years, and then those young adult years, then first years of motherhood if
Mm-hmm.
you're a mom, and then going in, and now my map is being redrawn yet again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of putting it. You described your move back to the States as one of the hardest of your life. Can you tell me more about that and what it was like for you to move back, and how did you practically, heal through that experience?
Right, right. So I think about this a lot because it did take me so long.
Mm,
I was 36 years old when we moved from Cairo to the United States. And I don't say we repatriated because we really hadn't lived in the United States with children.
right.
And so suddenly I'm in the greater Boston area, in the North Shore of Boston, in a small town. And I'm
Mm,
36 and I have 5 children.
wow.
And nothing in my life up till that point, it felt like nothing had prepared me for this small town,
Mm,
for raising children in the United States. I was scared to death to send them to school. My husband
mm,
actually had to take the three older ones to school the first time. I was so, so scared. And there was just this like backpack full of rocks, in
mm,
the rock of not belonging, the rock of other, the rocks of loss and grief. I grieved so much, especially that first year. uh, I was just so deeply, deeply homesick.
mm,
And it felt like, and again, in retrospect, when I look back, I think, okay, what could I have done differently? But it felt like at the time that everything I did was wrong. Uh,
mm,
I would show up to a potluck and I would have the wrong thing. I would
mm.
be at a Bible study and people would be talking about their favorite restaurant. And I'd say, oh, mine's this Turkish restaurant in Boston. And, it shut down the conversation.
Yeah,
So many instances like that. And I also was raising these children,
yeah.
and and was not good at it. And so this thing that I felt like,
Are any of us good at it?
I know, right? I felt like I knew how to do this overseas. I don't know how
Oh,
to do
yeah.
this here.
Wow.
So how did I get through it? Well, we moved.
Mm,
We moved after 7 years. We moved to Phoenix, Arizona. I
yeah.
got off the plane. It was 122 degrees in the shade. And it's like this burden fell off my
You're like,
back.
this feels like Egypt.
Yes, that's exactly right. I had this visceral connection, and something happened in that move
Mm,
that just settled me in a way that hadn't been settled. I still had deep longings to go back to the Middle East.
mm,
It wasn't over, but something settled. 5 years later, we end up back in this area again.
mm,
And I was terrified because of the experience before. We ended up living in the city, and that made a big difference.
yeah.
The city versus small town, in terms of just the connection to people around the world in the
Yeah.
city,
The
happened.
multicultural.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Whereas in the small town, it didn't.
Mm,
So uh, I do remember, though, the day when, when just this sort of day of surrender,
mm,
and that was a big, big piece of moving forward for me.
yeah. Yeah, it's so difficult, especially, I don't know if your move was unplanned. Like, what was the cause of you guys leaving Cairo?
Right. So this is a really, really good question. That came up recently in our move back from Iraq to the United States, or from the
Mm,
Kurdish region of Iraq. So we actually were struggling in our marriage, and there was no help.
mm, yeah. Yeah.
There was no help, and so it wasn't a reason you could tell people.
Right.
And
So it's
and I
even more
Yeah.
hidden and it creates even more
Yes.
shame.
Yes, exactly.
Mm,
I often tell people, and this was certainly true for me, is often as a child, the parts of the story that you don't know are the most important parts of all.
yeah.
And I realized with some of my kids that they didn't know. They thought it was education for children because that was so
Okay.
much easier,
Yeah.
and it's so much easier to say that than to say, we're struggling and we need help, and there is
Yeah.
no help here,
Mm,
and there is help here.
yeah. I really understand that, Marilyn. My husband and I also struggled in our marriage because we were so isolated. We were in a
Yes.
very small, remote village town of Uganda, and we had gone through a miscarriage, and we just were struggling to connect with each other. I was a workaholic. I was working for the ministry hours and hours and hours a week. And there was just all these traumas and griefs that built up that we just weren't really able to process at the speed of which they needed to be processed. And so we had to jump into marriage counseling, pretty soon after we got back because we were just in this very desperate situation. And I know a lot of other missionaries who are in similar situations where they're
Yeah.
they're having to make that difficult decision to leave for the to protect and save their marriage, to protect and save their kids. And so, but it's still a difficult decision to make, and it's one that comes at a
Yes.
great cost.
Right, right. Especially when you love a place.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you also said something else in your book that I really enjoyed. You said, when pieces are lost, we struggle to find them again. When you move a lot, it's easy to place your security in things, to begin to idolize place. Where was God in all this? We had to learn that God was permanent despite our impermanence. We had to
Hmm.
find God in pieces, stepping out in faith that there would be a new community that would come alongside us that could help us put together the pieces again.
Hmm.
And so, how has your faith been shaped by being
Wow.
a TCK? And what do you think that has given you? What gifts has it given you?
Because that was my favorite question, I think. It's truly shaped my faith in every way possible. I
Mm,
often describe my faith as my oxygen.
mm,
I can't imagine not having it. I have been through as many questions as anyone, and I have
yeah.
struggled and I have railed against God. I have been angry, and yet to think of not having that, it is so much worse. I
Mm,
think I've taken comfort from the fact that Christ, sort of the ultimate third culture kid, right?
yeah.
Leaving that identity, giving up. Uh, I think that verse in the Philippians, although he existed in the form of God, he did not count equality with God something to be
Yeah.
grasped. And I grasp onto these things. I
Mm,
mean, I held this identity like an idol. It was so important to me.
mm,
And so my faith has helped me work through this. I think that this whole idea of belonging, right? To
mm,
to recognize ultimately that my belonging has to be something more secure than a place. I mean,
yes. Yeah.
borders are redrawn, right?
Mm,
Look at our massive displacement in the world today. It's so many people lose home,
yeah.
and what is left in the process. And that's where really that quote that you read came
Mm,
from, is what does it look like to find my identity in a person instead of in a place, and instead of in being this third culture kid, knowing the world, uh,
yes.
loving the world, being able to talk about that. And I still hold on to that, right? I still have my days when uh, I'm an Enneagram 4. And so
Oh, that's awesome. I'm a 2, but my growth point is a 4, so I totally get you, the artist.
yeah, exactly. And so, I'm special, right? I mean, I always thought
Right.
it was the third culture kid thing. And then
Right.
I was talking to a friend, she's like, oh no, it's the Enneagram thing as well. It's the two combined. So I'm
Yeah.
a nightmare in some ways.
Mm,
But, it's hard, right? Because you think your experience is more special than anyone else.
right.
Uh, and so to recognize and to grow in an area of recognize my identity as in a person, not in a place,
Yes.
not even not in a religious, not even in a religious community. Although
Right.
I have found a faith community, but in the
Mm,
person of Christ.
yes.
But I am a really slow learner.
Yeah, I think we learn the hard way sometimes, but it is such a gift that God gives us, the gift of his presence. I think that
Yeah,
sometimes he takes us out. I remember going out to Uganda and just really having to dive deep in intimacy with Christ during that time. And then
yeah,
the same happened when on my return, when I repatriated, because all of a sudden again I was alone and my identity had completely been lost to me because I was no longer this nonprofit leader. Now I was just someone who was heartbroken, and I was
yeah.
the one in need of help. And so he had to just completely come in with the gift of his presence and
Yes.
heal me over time. But it is such a gift that we get when we do get to explore these other cultures.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you said that. I was remembering this article in the Boston Globe where this woman was dying and she invited these friends over for a brunch and they didn't want to go. You know, what are they going to talk about? What they can they give her? And finally one of them called and she said, "All I want is your presence." And I
Yeah.
think all my, my railing and my struggling and all, and yet ultimately what I most wanted was God's presence.
Yes, definitely. So I want to give some practical tips and tools to people because that's a passion of mine. And for parents of third culture kids and missionary kids, what advice or encouragement can you offer them to support their children overseas? Especially, I'm thinking of those that have been recently affected by COVID and having to
Mhm.
emergency evacuate and just have their entire lives turned upside down. Do you have anything that you've learned in your experience that you think might be helpful to them?
Right. So there's a couple things that come to mind. One is I really think parents need to release the guilt.
Mm,
The exercise I recommend people do is get a helium balloon, write guilt on it, and either pop it or just let it go up into the air.
mm,
Uh, I hear a lot. My kids didn't choose to grow up overseas, but that's the reality for any kid.
right,
No kid gets a choice in what their parents do. My husband didn't get a choice. He would have far rather had a university professor as
right.
a father. He had a car mechanic.
Yeah.
No one has a choice. So release the guilt. um, I think help your TCK own their story. There's a way
Mm,
of telling our stories rightly, not not worse than they are and not better than they are. So I think there's a way to do that. Connecting your kids with someone outside the family who can connect with them and has a vested interest in who they are. But the other thing I think is really big is understanding ambiguous loss. Over the
mm,
pandemic, that's what we saw, right? It was
yes.
this
Yeah.
leaving countries, not being able to say goodbyes, and it left you with this sense of, well, the place is still there, the school's still there, the work is
Right.
still there, and I'm not.
Yeah.
And that's, according to Pauline Boss, that's like the hardest loss to deal with. And
Right.
the way to deal with it, my understanding is recognizing that it's ambiguous.
Mm,
So I think that for a parent to understand ambiguous loss is one way to help their kids. The more they understand about ambiguous loss, the more they can offer that support to their children.
yeah.
Uh,
That's
but I,
amazing.
the other thing is, I mean, it, it's for all the pain, for all the struggle, I would not choose growing up any other way. And I do think parents
Yeah.
often need to hear that. And that's what I've heard from many, many third culture kids. And my
Yeah.
own children have given my husband and I so much grace. Like they
Yeah.
think this was wonderful. Our youngest, who didn't get to experience Egypt, he's like, he feels so
He's
cheated.
like, I'm bummed, Mom. What
Yeah,
are you
and
doing?
yeah, and actually he's the one that spent the most time as an adult overseas. He's been living in Greece for 7 years. He speaks
Oh,
Greek
well.
fluently. So
Yeah.
so it is a privilege. It comes with challenges, but it's also a gift.
Yeah. It is a gift. And seeing it that way is also part of the perspective shift and
Yes,
change I think that we need to have. So for
exactly.
TCKs themselves or those who have children who are TCKs, do you recommend things like counseling and community? And, what are some of the things, especially if they're having to repatriate, that you recommend?
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, I'm a big believer in finding that person that you can talk to. Sometimes
Yeah,
it's a formal counselor. I'm a big believer in formal counseling. I'm also a big believer in those friendships that can hear you and
yeah,
hold up a mirror to you. And they're not formal counseling, but they're voices of wisdom.
yeah,
I think career is important. I
yeah.
think that finding that niche
That
where
purpose. Yeah.
it might take you overseas or it might put you in a place, a really cross-cultural setting in your passport country.
Mm,
Um, so I think those things are
yeah.
really important. There's a lot of books out there now,
Yeah.
which is wonderful.
Yeah.
But finding your niche, I think the way I worded it one time is creating a meaningful present out of a cross cultural past.
Yeah.
And there are many ways to do that now, but it can take a long time. It can take a while. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, I think there's this given for a lot of parents that their kids will just go back to their passport country. And
Right.
I wish I wish I had had choices. I remember wrestling with this when I was a
Mm,
senior in high school. I wanted to go to L'Abri in Switzerland. I wanted
yeah.
to go to this other place in the UK, and it was sort of this, oh no, you go back to your passport country. I think there's
Right.
less of that now, but I
Mm-hmm.
think to be open that these kids have this wealth of experience in cross-cultural living, and to find that niche is an important piece. So to be willing to find those connections in unexpected places.
That's great. I know also for me with my TCK friends, a couple things that they said that helped them were their parents not denying their experience. So, like you said, if you have
Yes.
the guilt, then you might be more likely to say, oh, it wasn't that bad, or oh, we did the best we could.
Yes.
But when you actually listen and empathize with your children's struggles and their griefs
Yes.
about being a TCK or leaving their country they've known all their lives, then it's not saying, oh, and now I need to feel shame and feel bad for this. It's actually just saying, I acknowledge your experience. I can hear you. I understand this was hard for you, and I'm here for you. I think that has helped a lot of my friends. And the parents that didn't do that, it seemed like there was like a separation there, between because they didn't feel like their parents could ever actually admit the fact that their choices placed their kids in a struggle and something that
Yeah.
they had to overcome. So that's one big thing. And then I think that also a lot of my friends who are TCKs are big travelers. So,
Yes. Yeah.
we're always like,
Have
me
a travel
included,
budget.
me
No,
included,
that's
yes, have a travel
yeah.
budget. And you have to scratch that itch. You have to see the world like
Yes.
you were born in different places. You crave, to smell Turkish coffee and to see the tiles of Morocco, and you want to
Right.
do these things. And so definitely allowing for travel in your life and not trying to just, strong arm or stifle that out of your experience because it is a piece of
Love
who you
that.
are. Yeah. So those are some
Yeah.
things that I recommend, and just community. I mean, I think that one of the big losses we face coming, back to America is that it's a Western society is individualistic, and most of
Right.
the cultures overseas are very community driven. So the feeling of isolation and loneliness is amplified. And so I think that if you can find a community or locate community, like you said, maybe you have to move to a different place where it's more
Hmm.
multicultural. Maybe you have to be in a place where there's refugees or there's more people
Right.
like you. Maybe you need to, find other missionaries or other TCKs or expat groups or even online communities. I'm a part of several Facebook online communities, expats, missionaries, and just talking to people that understand your experience on a visceral level is just so important in the healing process. And of course, as you know, I'm a big proponent of counseling. I think that especially for children, giving them a chance at counseling to process some of these things as
Right.
they're coming home is very helpful. And then nowadays, of course, I didn't really have this when I was overseas, but nowadays there's tons of debriefing centers
Right.
and there's places to debrief. And I think that's really recommended now because there is so
Right.
much to unpack. There is so much
Right.
to, go through to be able to encapsulate your experience.
Right. There's two things that I thought of as you were talking. One was I really encourage people to take their partners to the place where they grew up.
Yeah,
I just think it
that's
is
great.
critically, critically important. We actually got engaged in Pakistan, which
Oh.
was just a huge thing.
I love that, staying connected to the culture. I've
Right,
been back to Uganda once, but when my son is a little bit older and we can save up enough money for all the flights, we want to
right,
go back to Uganda. And I want my women there and the kids there to meet my son, and I want him to
right.
understand this is where mommy spent a large portion of her life, and this was some of the
Right.
happiest days of my life were here. And so I think just staying connected to that culture too is a big part of feeling like you can just make sense of being this intermingled and intermixed person. You're not
Right,
just one culture, you're a fusion of
right,
cultures.
right, right. And there's, yeah, in making sense that this grief and loss is all of a part of it. I think too the whole, you know, taking away the but and putting in the end, like it
Mm,
was good and it was hard. I think that
yes.
is such a critical piece of growing in our story is this, I will always struggle with this and I'll always think this was amazing.
Yes.
It's interesting too because I've noticed with third culture kids that the healthiest ones do seem to be the ones who have gone gone back to the place where they were raised,
Mm,
or gone back and then moved to another country. There's something about seeing the place through the eyes of an adult instead
yes.
of constantly having just this memory of your childhood, is really healthy. Going back to Pakistan as an adult put me in a place of realizing, oh my gosh, there's things I don't like.
Right. Yeah.
Pakistan was perfect until then. And
Right.
then there was a bureaucracy that was really hard. I saw the
Yes.
sexual harassment in a far different light.
Yes.
I struggled with these different things around communicating that I was protected from as a child. So
Mm,
going back gives you just a different perspective. It shifts your perspective, it broadens it, and helps you realize, yeah, neither place is all good and neither place is all bad. I might
mm,
always feel more at home in this space, and at the same time, I've recognized where I can make a home and create a place in this
mm.
space as well.
That's such a good point, Marilyn. I think that you have to sometimes take the rosy, color glasses
Yeah,
off and see it for what
right,
it is. And it's easy in retrospect to romanticize it, but the reality
right,
is, I'm sure there were reasons it was difficult and challenging, and there were
right,
reasons maybe that your parents had to depart. And so I think that's great to be able to kind of seal it off with a bookend, or maybe
right.
we're never going to be able to tie nice ribbons in our stories,
No,
but at
yeah,
least there's a way to make peace with the decisions that were made, and to be able to still feel a part of a culture that you love, and
right.
be able to see it for what it truly is. So, wow.
Yeah, I think it's the whole thorns and roses, right? Okay, the
Yeah.
thorns and roses of a life overseas. We
Yes.
know that there are both.
Yes. And I like the both and. It is both and. So thank
Yeah,
you so much. This has been such a gorgeous conversation. And I hope that if you're a missionary, you have just heard how much your story matters, and how
mm,
much being between worlds can be a gift. And so, Marilyn, thank you for being here with me. And if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
right. So I blog at Communicating Across Boundaries,
Okay.
and I never stopped blogging right through, and evidently it's coming back. And I think, okay, good. I never stopped blogging, so I still blog. At Instagram, I'm at Marilyn Gardner 5, I think. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Marilyn Gardner 5.
And where can people buy your books?
Oh, thank you. So, anywhere books are sold, if you buy them from the publisher, Doorlight Publications, I believe they're cheaper. Or if you want to send me an email, I'm happy there's a way you can connect on my
Okay.
blog and send me a message, and I'm happy to send the books at cost.
Great. And you
So,
have two
thank you.
books, correct?
2 books,
Okay.
exactly, right.
Okay. Well, yeah, definitely, guys, pick up her books. I think one is Between Worlds and the other one is Worlds Apart. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly, worlds
perfect.
apart.
Awesome. And
Thank
if you
you.
want to connect with me, you can connect on my website, www.saritahearts.com. And on there, you can actually download my new free ebook on reentry. So if you're going through reentry or have just gone through reentry, it's a perfect help to you. If you're in transition, you can also connect with me on Instagram at Sarita Hearts. And please, please subscribe to the podcast, share it, leave a review. It's so helpful in spreading this message to other missionaries and third culture kids. So, Marilyn, you're a delight, and I'm so glad we finally got to meet each other, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Me as well. Thank you so much, Sarita.
All
This
right.
has been a joy.
Thank you. Well, my dears, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I want to leave you with a quote from my patron saint, Kate Bowler. Blessed are you when you don't belong, when you can't explain exactly how you ended up here, outside of what was acceptable but longing to fit in nonetheless. Blessed are you in the alienation and fear, where will I find my people, the confusion of anger or the still woundedness from unbelonging. May you feel your own worthiness, may you know your own belovedness. May you find wrapped in a story larger than the one you can trace, a story of love, hope, and courage, a story truer than one you've been told. Blessed are you in this family of God. So I pray that you feel a sense of belonging today, that no matter if you are a third culture kid, that you can know that somewhere in the world you can find your people. And as always, my loves, tune in next time, subscribe, and leave a review. It's so helpful to me. Take care.